the explosion in automation and the sort of imagined mastery of the physical environment that we have in the sort of materialist legacy thinking was driven by fossil fuels and hydrocarbon energy. And without that, or if there's a scarcity of that, or if there's a commodification of that that's not based on a universal ownership, wouldn't much of this automation depend on our billion years of legacy fossil fuels that we're burning up in a couple of generations?
At this stage, but that brings in a whole new subject of where we are with renewables and our understanding of renewables and the vast applications of so many different forms of energy that we really do have. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with where we are with advancements in solar and geothermal and wind, different forms of radiation that are, that are actually
I've heard mixed reviews.
Excuse me?
I've heard mixed reviews.
Well, there's of course mixed reviews, and most of the establishment scientists will get very cynical on the issue. But you just have to think very simply, and there's plenty of scientists, by the way, that are actually very acutely pushing forward without the inhibitions of most of these market. I mean, the reason they push nuclear and what's the other traditionalist establishment alternative they have right now? Well, or what's the big one though? Hydrogen, right? They're pushing the hydrogen things mostly. The reason they do that is because it supports the infrastructure that's existed prior, because that's where the market element comes into play. It permeates the values and consciousness of all these people at the top, as opposed to every single building in Los Angeles having built-in solar panels that could easily, through battery technology and supercapacitors, house and power every day to infinity for the next 4 billion years. If the energy was put forward to that, you wouldn't even need centralized power construction in most cases. Now, but it depends on what the efficiency means. Most homes could be equipped with such things, and Jacques Fresco is brilliant on these subjects. I'm sure you're familiar with his work on some level, but the renewable energy stuff, he's numerous wonderful concepts of invention that really have been coming to fruition over the course of the past 5 years in pockets. In fact, we have a website called zeitnews.org, which does nothing but document advancements in energy and advancements in technology that are for social concern. There is, I can say definitively, no energy problem. We are energy, everything is energy. We are simply locked into this distorted paradigm that's been using hydrocarbons for so long and an infrastructure that supports a market system. If we went into objective energy usage in the renewable sense, meaning we just did whatever was right, whatever made sense, as opposed to what we needed to make money, then for one, there wouldn't be an energy market. It would all be localized. And you wouldn't have the massive multi-trillion-dollar energy institution that you have now. And that's really what the barrier is. So back to your original point, automation can be powered. Just like when we send spaceships into space, they're all solar powered. Once they get in there, these things are there, and they've been there for a long time. And between battery technology, supercapacitors, and the very fact that everything is related to the sun one way or another, all of our forms of energy are derived from the sun one way or another. You just have to put this into perspective. As long as the sun is there, we're doing fine, and there's a massive abundance, I can assure you. So I have no problems with the nature of automation. Frankly, I think solar power and geothermal will be the dominant energy sources in the future. Run into supercapacitors, which create redundancy almost to infinity, probably, based on how it develops.
Finally, there's a question that has less to do with logic and logistics, or maybe it does have a lot to do with logic and the capacity for discerning logic versus sophistry and pulling people into a higher level paradigm. You said that people often are blocked. When you can't use logic on somebody, and when they haven't studied propositional logic and got a degree in philosophy, how do you change their emotional mind?
I think, and I'm sorry to hog the questions here. I have a tendency to do this, so after this, I'm gonna let everyone answer questions first. What I would say is, Well, for example, the Zeitgeist Media Festival that we're attending, a lot of people say, well, what's that about? You guys, well, it just sounds like some party or something. Actually, no. Art has, like the Renaissance, art has always been the initiator in my mind, in my history actually. It could be subject to interpretation, but if you really look back at history, the initiators of new paradigms of thought have always come from a more of artistic standpoint. They haven't been rigid academics or scientists in a very, there's an overflow of ambition and speculation and basically everything that defines the sort of experimental nature of art. And why my film series is very gestural, if you've seen any of them, there's always a heavy pocket of gestural stuff associated. It's because you're trying to break that hardening that people have. And the media festival, as opposed to, say, Zeitgeist Day is a straight intellectual event similar to this, but it's very long, and it uses multiple speakers, and it's very intense. The media festival is saying, okay, let's try to get under people's skin with the sense of values that are associated with the intellectual stuff that we talk about. So the people that we feature have a social context. So when people experience this and they come out of it, I hate to use the word brainwashing, but all of us are brainwashed one way or another. So it's a false term in and of itself because we can't possibly exist in any thought process without the influence of others and the kind of reciprocal reinforcement that makes it viable to us over time, such as trying to talk to somebody that's really indoctrinated into religion. It doesn't matter how much logic you pull out. They just believe what they believe, and they've established, usually pre-established, methods of defense against anything that challenges them. And the core element of most religious philosophy is, oh, if you question your religion, it's a sin. So boom, they got you right there. You can't even question it. So, but that's the way most people think in the economic sphere. They have a framework of, they question outside of it, suddenly you become a fringe, you become a conspiracy theorist, or you become something that is not acceptable socially, and that's what keeps people inhibited. It's really the external view of them. Like, ooh, if I change my mind on something, I might be seen as somebody who isn't centered or really understanding the world around me, so I can't possibly change my mind, the ego thing, you know. So these are the things we have to overcome, and I don't claim to have some universal application or approach to this, but I know that art, to me, is critical for human evolution, for that experimental element of it, and really scientific ingenuity has always been an art form, you know. It's always been this experiment of ingenuity. So I think the people, as time moves forward, that are so hardened will first hopefully be affected by the breakdown that's occurring that will challenge them, because most of their values, I think, will be challenged as this continues. They will hopefully identify with some elements that will resonate. You know, for example, no one likes to see people suffer, at least I don't think most people do. It's not inherent to the condition. We have these empathetic qualities. And then there is the... Then there's the mass appeal. And this is where the Zeitgeist movement hopefully can manifest manifest a mass large enough where people feel comfortable identifying with something that they prior might have felt was too radical for their association or made them seem obtuse in their inner circle. You know what I mean? Because there is a sheepish quality to human behavior. If all of us started running really fast this way, many of you would react and instinctually to want to run with us. This is the way the sort of social organism works, and that's used for manipulation. I mean, obviously, look at the abuse of major events. Throughout the course of history, how wars are engineered, lots of things about creating psychological pressures that create that sheepish mass appeal. And that can be worked in a negative sense, or it can be worked in a positive sense. You would hope that people would have the internal integrity to exist on their own objectively, but that doesn't work that way. So there is a strategy, and it's intrinsically manipulative, just like any type of conversation is. The difference is that you hope that whatever you do to persuade people brings them in just enough where they can realize it for themselves, and it's not some sheepish thing where they just believe blindly something. That's exactly the opposite of what it takes to understand this movement, because it really demands of its firm personal identification, because you have everything against you otherwise.
Fight fire with fire.
Sure, in a sense, to a certain degree. To a certain degree, it's a delicate balance. Yeah.
Hi, Peter, I just want to say I love your movies. I've seen them all and several times, and they're just awesome. My question has to do more with, I guess, what this movement is proposing. And my understanding, based on the movie, was it reminded me of like a communism, that kind of idea. And what I'm kind of asking is because I grew up in a communist country. It was called Czechoslovakia. And so we were all supposed to be equal and sharing everything, and it was supposed to be all great, and it wasn't. Obviously, it didn't work. And so I was just wondering, like, why do you think that what you're proposing, how is that going to be different? Because, you know, that was kind of tried and it failed, and so I was kind of just wondering.
Okay, I'll let others answer this too, but I'll just say that those models that existed prior, they never had a relationship to something physical. They were based on ideologies. So you go back to Marx, you go back to Engels. They talked about a certain view of humanity, a philosophical view, but very rarely in any of that literature, or definitely not in the approach, did it say, okay, what makes sense for human society? What can we derive from a scientific view? Why do we want to share the resources? What's the reasoning for it? And is the condition that we're going to create going to be conducive to it? Communism never had a chance because it was working within a monetary-driven environment, a greed-driven environment, a property-driven environment globally anyway. So there was never, like people say, well, this is, you know, Marx wanted to have a moneyless society, which isn't exactly true. But they throw this out assuming such a thing. But see, the thing is, I don't think communism really manifested in any way that it was supposed to manifest, first of all, if you really go back and read it, and then look at the Bolshevik Revolution and the interests and values they had, and then what actually happened when the dictatorships were created.
But the idea was
the idea might have been similar.
Equal and share.
But this isn't about just blind equality in the sense of, oh, that's just a nice thing to do. This is about, we have to do this, otherwise the instability that arises from the imbalance, from the motivations that are distorted will get the better of us one way or another. That big chart of debt is really an expression of a mass kind of delusion of greed and distortion that many different people are manifesting in tandem, and they don't realize it though. In other words, it's hard, it's an abstract point. Everything we're seeing today socially that's problematic is coming from a frame of reference that's wrong and has no relationship to anything tangible. And communism, as it was practiced, was exactly the same way. And it still ended up with money, it still ended up with military and police and dictators in control. And if you didn't believe it, well, very often you were deposed, or, I mean, these are very serious things that are reminiscent of a very messed up period of time. The logic behind the Zeitgeist movement, though, comes from what I consider to be an empirical place. It's not based on a floating philosophy or any assumptions. Granted, all scientific knowledge is an assumption on some level, but it comes from the life ground and says, okay, how do we maintain stability? How do you make an environment we don't have to go into an airport and be groped, molested, exactly. What does it mean to have security? And on the fundamental level, specific to your point, is the equality notion really is a sustainability notion, but it has to be true equality. You can't allow the loose notion of equality to permeate some lower class and then let the upper class do whatever they want. And to combat that, the whole system has to be specifically created based around the principles that we describe related to resources, with everyone understanding it thoroughly so everyone can participate in it. And these are big statements, and I apologize, I can get more specific, but I would talk forever on it. Because
but you're saying that would have to happen globally then? You cannot have like one country doing it?
Definitively speaking.
So unless it happens everywhere,
so
then it's...
We're a global movement, and so a lot of the differences are that there's not a national focus. There's not a social stratification of a ruling class and a working class. We're talking about technical reference, technical solutions, solving basic life problems, but also bringing everyone up to the highest level, standard of living that's possible, keeping things sustainable, given that that's what, if we all sat down and really thought about it, logically, this makes sense for everyone.
And then there's the property issue. Okay, communism always had, oh, there's no property. You know, that was the staple. No one really ever asked, what's that?
Everything belonged to everybody, supposedly.
Sure. Yeah. But no one ever asked why, in the sense of, what does that mean? If you come from an environmental standpoint, you say, okay, is it really smart environmentally on a finite planet with finite resources for every single human being to own an automobile they drive maybe 10% a day at the most? These rationales say, okay, we have a society, people are living in close quarters. Let's devise a system of sharing these
No, absolutely
elements.
agree.
So you see the rationale becomes self. So the property issue isn't really just an issue of a philosophical association of no one owning and communal ownership. This isn't about so-called communal ownership and abstraction. It's about what do we have to do to be as sustainable as we can, allowing for the most people to have access to the things that they need and beyond, and how do we create a system that brings that together.
Right, but we know that the zip car was, they tried it in LA and failed.
But it works really well in New York.
Right, but not.
And in Chicago.
Well, okay, great, I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Hi everyone, how are you?
Good.
So I had a couple questions. First was, what is the main role of government, or how is government handled in a resource-based economy? And second was, I mean, since the government, in this current paradigm, in our current society, they handle, the lawmaking and the legislation and defining morality, basically, for all of us. How is that handled in a resource-based economy? Basically, how would a resource-based economy define morality and, enforce it if need be?
Natural law. That's what the basis of it is. That natural law would be what we all have in common, that as opposed to one imposed on us by a governmental system.
Or I would say that you arrive at the morality, or what I'd put it more specifically as values. Mm-hmm. You'd arrive at your values from something tangible as opposed to something that's just traditionally presented to you. See, people value a lot of strange things in our culture, from religion to patriotism, to their leaders, and to a lot of strange things like fascination with the celebrities. And there's all these things that have been imposed on people that create that gesture, that reinforce itself. Government is a huge concept, though. Government, as we have a lot of treatment on this, and it's something that's difficult for me to describe in a singular way. But what you want is a systems approach to Earth management where government actually doesn't exist in any realm that we think of today. You have, what is really the facilitation of government really at its core, if you were to remove all the layers of nonsense, all the wars, all the things that are brought out of.
Yeah, deciding who gets what. Right?
It's economics. Government is really a form, should be the management of an economy and nothing more. But what we're dealing with is we're coming out of a history of dynasties and emperors, and our system today is just an echo of those early basically feudalistic type of stratified systems. So to get over that hurdle is an extremely huge thing because of the values that are ingrained in that, and then the people that do follow leaders and expect that. But to say it definitively, a resource-based economic model is simply about resource managing and making available what we can in the broadest, most sustainable way possible. And if any of us were in government, so to speak, which would probably be interdisciplinary teams working with automated systems, because it's like a military operation. That's a great way, as weird as it sounds. Imagine if you took the Pentagon with all of its insane technology and artificial intelligence, decision-making programs they use for combat, and you switched all of that around to resource management and taking care of the planet and figuring out strategies to provide for the entire human population. That's really what the government of the future would be.
But I mean, as far as like laws go and justice system and all that,
the goal is
would it be like more like an anarchy type system?
No, because you'd have the system arranged. The rules of the system become self-evident based on the approach. So if everyone in the society has to accept the basic premise of the system, they have to realize the natural law referent. They have to understand that it makes sense for them to share their resources. They have to realize that they need to be sustainable and not, just waste. I mean, these are values that most of us have anyway, but they're contrary to what the system supports. Bottled waters and wasting and gas guzzling huge Hummers, and everything's counter to what's really rational for a species like us to live on a finite planet. It's completely irrational. So the general acceptance, which is what makes our work so difficult, is of that nature. We have to get people to understand what it means to be sustainable. And then the system is an outgrowth of that. So things like laws, for example, what is a law? As I mentioned earlier, law is really a patch. It's something to counter an intent that's inherent in the system. It's a structural flaw. So you have all these laws on monetary corruption. Why do they exist? Well, first of all, I won't go on that tangent. The monetary corruption law structure, which is the majority of laws, really, if you really look at the vast majority of laws, they all relate to money one way or another. At least 90%.
Yeah, like the tax code and
yeah, a gigantic, ridiculous thing that you can't possibly comprehend. You know, it's entrapment is all it is, because they know that they can do whatever they want, but that's a whole other subject. But the law structures, you have to understand what it is, first of all, which is a patchwork system. And when you realize that, you devise the system to take care of itself, meaning that it hyperbolates to it's a system without laws, because it's taking care of itself intrinsically. And I can go on a long tangent on human behavior, and I'm sure there's lots of people that could debate on the intrinsic quality of what people are, if they have negative tendencies or positive tendencies. And that's really the core of the debate, if you find that as a point of debate. But everything else, in all things being equal as far as conditioning, you see my point. The system, if it's designed correctly, doesn't need laws.
right, like
Right?
based on the life sequence of value,
You could relate it to that, but it's also based on, yeah, actually you're right, based on life sequence and the life ground and everything that extrapolates from that. So we know what our human needs are: water, the types, how much energy we need, carbohydrates. You know, these things that can be calculated. We know the fixed state of the planet, what we can utilize, how much we can use, the dynamic equilibrium. When you start to think about it in a responsible way, scientifically, the entire system becomes utterly self-evident. There's variance, naturally, because it's emergent, but the fundamental attribute of it is always there, you know?
Right.
And I don't see how anyone can argue that basic foundation. And that's what, frankly, humanity has been searching for since the beginning of time, is finding that empirical relationship. And I think that we finally found that.
I just want to add that
why society should be
the resource-based model that we're talking about does presuppose that a value shift has taken place to a large degree, which is what we're attempting. We call it an evolution versus a revolution, but it is a paradigm shift that's needed, because this is something that is not to be forced on anyone. That wouldn't even maintain itself. You have to have people desiring this, and the people involved in the movement understand and want this now, but we need to try to make others come to the same conclusion through communication, through talking about the shared values that we have, and that's what we're all about.
And just a note on the idea of, is this some sort of anarchist concept? As if you removed all the laws today, it would be a big free-for-all, and we just claw each other to death and take each other's stuff. What happens is that the behaviors are reinforced in the environment, and it's not like you're just going to take the tax code or the laws in the books and just toss them out tomorrow and think everyone's just going to agree to do that. You evolve out of it, because when you address the conditions that are creating the behavior, so say, for example, if you could no longer sell a bicycle that you stole on the street, then the reinforcement, the reward for stealing it, would be the acquisition of money or whatever resource. When you address the environment so those needs are met, then the behavior is impacted, and then you see a reduction in what you would consider the aberrant behavior, which the laws represent patchwork to deal with in the current social system. So you would see over time that as you address the life sequence needs, that you impact the behaviors that are prevalent and that we have all the law enforcement and the prisons and police and wars over. So hopefully that gives you a perspective on that.
I would add one thing to that. One thing you point out as a sense of trying to engage is, I always ask people, go to your Congress or go to the law book and just look at every single law that's in existence and ask yourself, where's the causality? Because all laws assume no causality. That's the assumption of a law.
Can I ask a question in relation to that?
Gotta get the microphone.
With the mic that was in the queue. Sorry, guys. Just hold on to your question. We'll get to it. Hold on to that. Just go ahead.
Okay. This question is mainly for you, Peter, because I've heard you say something to the effect of that all acts of commerce are inherently corrupt.
Right.
Okay. And given that we currently live in a monetary market system, and I'm a big supporter of the Zeitgeist movement. I share about it with people, and I'm totally on board with the possibility of it. And we live in a monetary market system now, and I have goals to be successful in
course,
this system, and
Right.
I've read or I'm reading Think and Grow Rich and done Tony Robbins, and they talk a lot about the mindset of success and all that. So I'm trying to kind of be dual-minded of having all the empowering context around my entrepreneurial goals, while at the same time having the awareness of the what you said of the all acts of commerce are inherently corrupt. So I'm trying to kind of be empowered with my goals in the environment I'm in the system that I'm in and we're all in now, while still being aware. And I think his name's Joel, was it? Or, Joe, sorry. Was really inspired by what you're sharing, and I was like, oh, that guy's expressing what I ultimately want to do is, kind of influence the influencers, and I have actually shared about the resource-based economy with my employer, and he was, he's a very successful kind of multi-millionaire guy, and he was totally on board with it. He gets it. So I don't think the ultra rich are. They wouldn't not be inspired by it. They get it too. So
it's never a fixed culture, but those that are most rewarded by the system tend to be more apprehensive, but not always. I've met some very poor people that are so indoctrinated, and usually they just have a lack of education, and they automatically have knee-jerk reactions to say, well, it just sounds like communism, and it's just going to be like Stalin, and then this is another element to it. But I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah. So my question is, do you have any advice about kind of a mindset to have to be empowered as someone wanting to be successful in the system we're in now, while still being aware of the I kind of would like to know more of what you meant by saying that all.
Well, I can put it in a more kind way.
Go ahead.
Instead of all acts of commerce being corrupt, you can't live in this system without being corrupt. So there's the first point. You can't function, you can't behave in this society without some level of corruption. I define corruption by dishonesty and a negligence of your environment, and anything that requires negligence of your surroundings for your own self-interest is intrinsically corrupt, whether you're raising the profit margin on a good that you sell versus, say, Enron shutting down of the California power grid so they can trade up their equities and make money. These are equally the same element of the same spectrum. They're just different extremes. One's more socially acceptable than the other because that's what the system is. But what I do, and I talk to people, especially depends how young they are, I often say, well, whatever your focus is, try to make it in an area, in a discipline that has some type of social return. Whether you're doing something in green industries or those that are doing advanced agriculture or doing energy research, usually something to do with science and engineering, something that actually creates something as opposed to what Joe does. All that paper he keeps making that's floating in the ocean somewhere. But there's the paradigm though, but don't beat yourself up over it. And I have the same issue. I walk a unique line. I think we all do. And what I do is I try to balance my life. I divide it into two spheres. I say, okay, I'm going to survive. I have to do something to maximize myself. But I don't let it get to me, and I don't let the greed take over because I understand it well. At least I feel I do. So I don't go out of my way to just keep maximizing like most people do. That's where their sense of accomplishment comes from. Hundreds of thousands, then millions and millions. I calculated a long time ago that if I was to generate, and I don't have nothing near this, but I say this to some audiences, I asked the audience, what if you had, $8.5 million? If someone gave you $8.5 million at your birth, and you never had to submit to a corporation, would you be satisfied with that, which equates to roughly $70-some thousand a year? And of course, everyone's hand goes up. But they don't realize what they're doing. I mean, they're given that freedom of association with that sort of concept, but what they're saying is that they're willing to live in a way that's modest, so to speak, live in a way that doesn't require the constant infatuation with getting more and more, which is so hideously reinforced in our system, because it's always about more and more. So now, not only do people have the iPad, now they have the iPhone, and now they get the 17th generation of the iPod. And God knows what other thing will come out next that everyone has to have. I mean, I'm not a Luddite, obviously, but I also think we go way too far. But anyway, I'm diverting from your point. You have to be satisfied with a balance and try not to be too affected infected really by the culture around you that wants to constantly maximize and reinforce things that are basically greed orientations and utter self-preservation, while also recognizing the problems. Like I operate along with everyone here at Great Sacrifice because we see that it's really a social problem holistically, and that it's going to affect all of us as these problems arise. Many more that haven't been talked about tonight. Keeping that knowledge too will cater your behavior as well. And change that. I might reach a point where a lot of people out there think they're going to maximize themselves and get that big house, like the boomer generation. Those days are really over for the West. It's all downhill from here. Once the U.S. is downgraded, it's bankruptcy within probably 2 years. There's systemic crises that will emerge from that. I think mass destabilization. A lot of the ways people think about their lives and getting the white picket fence. These days are it's very different what's on the horizon for the great majority of the population. Does that help? If anyone else has something to say on that, but you walk a line, you accept where you are in that hideous paradox that we all who believe in a better world and a social world that wants to help other people and not just maximize yourself, because you know it's in your self-interest to make sure everyone around you is doing well. This is the utter clash of values that we're with the movement and everything else that we're doing. We hope to plant that seed where people move away from that. That's why the Zeitgeist Media Festival is really kind of an anti-economy festival in a lot of ways. A lot of people that are performing are very much against the system. And remember back in the 90s, back in the 90s, they had the big bling generation, and all the groups came out with it's all gold and bling and money. And it was all the reinforcing values, everything that this system needs to perpetuate itself. We need to reverse that in the public mind, where people are disgusted by money. They're disgusted by vanity. They're horrified by Tori Spelling's house. They cringe at the idea of having 2 jets parked in their front lawn because of how incredibly wasteful, what a concept that be. We have to shift the status orientation, and that's really the major mind trick here.